There's Dr. Wang.
Hi, I'm so
Yay.
sorry. I ended up
Why?
clicking the Google Meet link instead of
It
the
happens
Zoom.
all the time. I know. I've done it myself. And I've been waiting and waiting and waiting on Zoom, and it doesn't matter. You're here. I'm so glad to see your face and to
Oh,
meet you, Dr.
likewise.
Jenny Wang. This is just such a pleasure. I'm such a fan
Oh,
of yours, the work you do.
thank you.
Just a few sort of housekeeping things just to let you know that I do ask people to just mute their devices, and if there are any questions or comments that they just drop them into the chat, and I will facilitate those for you just so it doesn't drive you crazy. But certainly you're welcome to take a look yourself and answer anyone's questions. I will get us started. Thank you all who are here. This is terrific. We are speaking today with Dr. Jenny Wang. She's a clinical psychologist and national speaker on Asian American mental health and racial trauma in Asian American, BIPOC, and immigrant communities. Her work focuses on the intersection of Asian American identity, mental health, and social justice. I'm just going to pause for a second and ask everyone to please mute. She is the founder of the Asians for Mental Health Instagram community, in which she discusses the unique experiences of Asian diaspora and immigrant communities. She spearheaded the Asian Pacific Islander and South Asian American Therapist Directory and its companion Canadian directory to help Asians seek culturally relevant mental health providers. Dr. Wang is also the author of Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health for Asian Americans. Dr. Wang, thank you so much again for being here. It is just our pleasure. Welcome to the Perry community.
Thank you.
Your intro, your bio, if you will, sort of really lands the plane on the work that you do and really kind of where your focus might be. I just wonder if you would share with us for a moment kind of what drives your work.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all who are joining. It is such a wonderful space to be here this morning. When I think about what drives my work, I think about like the childhood me and the young mom that I had who came to the United States when she was 25 years old, couldn't speak English, navigating a whole new world, and the unique challenges that came with being an immigrant, came with being alone in a country that was so new at such a young age. And I think for a long time in mental health training, that part of my identity was like a footnote. It was like a, make sure you acknowledge someone's cultural background or kind of consider it. But mental health is actually this, the diagnostic codes, the criteria that somebody has to fulfill. And I think over the course of my career, I've realized that actually this cultural background, this generational story, that is mental health. That's what informs how a person shows up. And so I think my goal was to help bridge that gap professionally speaking, writing the book, was to say the identity that you hold is huge in how you are going to protect and maintain your mental health, and is a source of strength too. Yeah. And I think about the menopause stage, and I think about all the cultural practices that many cultures have around how women take care of themselves and take care of each other through that stage. And so it's something that I think I could talk about this all day, because I think it resonates across communities, not just Asian communities.
Absolutely.
Right. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. It's funny because as I was preparing to speak with you, and I truly, I'm so just absorbed by your work and your commitment to people. And I was sort of struggling initially to sort of parse out who we're talking to and about, and what your work highlights so well. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to ask again that everyone please mute their device. What you do just so or what I was concerned sort of about is conflating things that maybe didn't necessarily make sense. So,
Mm.
you know, the conversation around perimenopause and menopause, which will affect half the population, presumably, barring any unforeseen circumstances. And then sort of like saying, you know, speaking to this race and this ethnicity, and, you know, kind of like piecemealing people. And I think what you're really do in the work that you really sort of speak to is what you just said, that we are these whole beings with these experiences, and all of that informs our mental health. And so when we're speaking about women who are entering into perimenopause or going through perimenopause, that experience will also be informed by all of where they came from, who they are, their experiences, their family of origin, and so on. And so anyway, with that being said, that all of those things might sort of trigger anxiety or blow out anxiety or any of that. I'm curious, sort of, what was the first thing that came to mind for you when you thought about the surprising connections between perimenopause and anxiety?
Hmm. I think when we think about like that perimenopause stage, which typically they'll say could start around 40 and beyond, I'm thinking of the multiple roles that we hold as women in that age range, right? I mean, I just turned 40 this year.
Happy
And
birthday.
thank you. And my kids are young. My parents they're healthy, but they are aging.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a child of immigrants too, we don't have family nearby. All our family's still in Taiwan. So I'm holding this very fine balance between my life, what I'm trying to do with my career and my family, and trying to hold space for my parents. So it naturally is an anxiety-provoking season of life because of the demands and the responsibilities that we have in this season, you know? And so already the stressors are perhaps heightened or higher.
Yeah.
That being said, now you have hormonal shifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ones that maybe can be subtle, or ones that seem to overtake us. And we might attribute it to, oh, these situational things, right? I just had a really hard month, or I just had a really hard time because of X, Y, and Z. We might not actually think this is due to these hormone changes that are undercurrent to our lives in that season. So I think that's what comes up, is it's almost like this confluence of a lot of different things. And we may not even think, maybe I should go to my OB and get some hormone values checked, just to see if there's some biologic reason for why I feel the way I do.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. It's funny. I think about this a lot. When I first stepped into this space to talk about perimenopause and menopause, I was actually really impacted by an article I had read in New York Magazine that was titled Midlife Psychosis. And it was about, I know it was terrifying. Truthfully, it was terrifying. It was all about, it featured a few women whose lives were really upended by the hormonal changes that they experienced. And they were extreme in many ways. But what's not extreme and what is so threatening is these experiences, these feelings, these sort of mental, emotional, psychological challenges that you can enter into, I think, you know, even in your late 30s, and really not start connecting those dots. And sort of the sooner that we're able, and I think we do that by having conversations like this, kind of amplifying this piece of the puzzle, I think the quicker it might occur to women, oh, this could be that. Let me seek out help. I just want to read something and get to another piece of this. You share a lot about parenting, and there was a post that you shared about the anxiety in your home that stemmed from you or your siblings being sick, and how it almost instinctively like it triggered anxiety for you when one of your children wasn't feeling well, and you posed things, you know, what if he can't go to school, what if he has to stay home, what if we can't work? And you said, and yet after I calmed my nervous system, I reminded myself that I would have options, support, or flexibility if I needed it. all things that my parents lacked in their early days of immigration to this country. And again, it caused me to think about how these childhood moments, these sensations, these emotions that happened years ago, we actually do carry into adulthood, and threading in perimenopause, as you just pointed out, can awaken these kind of painful, sticky things. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Yes. And I love how you use the word sticky, because I actually use that
Do
concept
you?
in clinical practice, right? It's this sense of like, when our capacity, which is this sense of resiliency, right? Like strength is thick, I say. It's almost like we're
Mm.
wearing like a cushion right around
Mhm.
us. Then when stressors arise, as they always do, we have the cushioning to
Mm.
respond to it in a way that maybe is more regulated. But when that capacity is thinned out, let's say you've been sick, or you're not sleeping well, or you're feeling depressed or anxious, the capacity shrinks because the psychological energy
Mm.
placed into those areas, right, is draining. And so just like hormonal changes, just like anxiety or depression during perimenopause, our capacity shrinks, but we don't think that. We're thinking, I need to push on. I
Mm.
need to keep going. I need to be strong. I need to tolerate all of this
Right.
without maybe seeking help or reaching out. And so the thing that is really interesting is when those hormonal changes occur and we feel that thinning of capacity, then you're right. It can activate some of these old ingrained anxiety patterns that we may have observed in childhood, that we might have surrounding our current life circumstances. It almost starts to like activate them, right? Because when we're full in your capacity, we can kind of keep them tampered. Like we could be like, okay, I know that I have
Yeah, so
time-based
good.
anxiety, or I know that I get triggered in this way and I can cushion myself. Well, when that cushion is gone, then any little stressor related to those old seated patterns can activate us. And that's really overwhelming because it can feel like it's all coming out at the same time.
That's so helpful. And I love that you use the word activate, because
Mm.
it does in many ways sort of feel like something is laying dormant, and it's only doing that because we're sort of dialed up, right? Our capacity is dialed up. Our hormones are sort of like all, firing on all nicely balanced cylinders, and then suddenly they're not. And
Right.
and we don't have the ability to kind of keep that cushion sort of nice and
Mhm.
thick. That's so
Mhm.
helpful and interesting. I have a community member question for you, but I wanted
Okay.
to also sort of leave space for you to say, actually, there's another 4 other surprising things. So please, if there's something else that comes to mind for you right now, by all means, let us know.
Yeah, I think the only thing that comes to mind is like if you think about, right, the buzzword in mental health right now is self-care,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yes.
love it and I also don't love it because it's turned into this kitschy marketing thing as well, right?
Yeah.
I think when I think about self-care and why it's important, and especially for women who are going through perimenopause and that season, is it's all about that cushioning.
Mm.
Self-care can build that cushioning for us, right?
Hmm.
When I am disciplined to sleep at a good time for me and I get enough sleep, it's not fun, it's not sexy, it's not what marketing says self-care is, but that is self-care. And it increases my threshold, or what we call window of tolerance, for
Mm.
these stressors. So that's why I think, if you can frame it as like, no, it's not that there's something wrong with me, I'm not capable, I'm deficient, I can't meet the demands of my life, but it's that cushioning builds up and then it gets depleted and it builds up yet again. The problem is that a lot of us, we're not really good at checking in with ourselves to say, ooh, that cushioning is thinned out. I need to actually say no. I need to set boundaries. I need to take care of myself to build that cushioning back up, right? So we don't realize until we've hit burnout, we've hit emotional exhaustion. So I would say that, like, you know how when we get sick, we like baby ourselves a little bit, or I hope we do, right?
Yeah.
We cancel appointments, we sleep more, we stay in bed, we nourish ourselves with foods that feel, right, replenishing. In the perimenopausal season, and I know it's a
Mm.
long time for some of us, I think we have to hold it tenderly as well. That it's not
Mm.
business as usual, that that's an unrealistic expectation imposed by a lot of structures, right, around us, capitalism, patriarchy, all of that. And that we actually need to think of it as a season of recuperation,
Mm.
restoration.
Oh, this is so good. I have the chills. It's so good. And I'm so appreciative. Sorry. I'm so sorry, Dr. Wang. I want to just ask everyone to please mute your devices again. There's like a sound coming in that is like, honestly, it's got me a little nervous. I don't know what's happening. So please, please, please mute your devices. Um Sorry, Dr. Wang.
All good, all good.
I'm sure you've heard it all, but
Yep.
I maybe haven't in this arena. Um, when you speak about self-care, I'm so glad you brought that up. I too I'm guilty of throwing that terminology out a lot. And then I sort of, things like that happen, right? They kind of build momentum, and everyone's talking about self-care, and everyone's using sort of these flag words that now everyone thinks they sort of understand. But digging deeper into that and really understanding what that looks like, what it can look like, and really sort of running it parallel to this season of life, and exploring how important it is to sort of treat yourself very tenderly. Thank you so much for that. That's just incredibly helpful. Okay, I'm going to get to a community member question.
Let's do it.
This person says, I have sudden sexual anxiety or anxiety about having sex with my husband. What the hell? How did this happen? And what can I do? What should I say about it? Now, this person, she didn't sort of go on to kind of illustrate more of what that anxiety looks like, but I'm certainly, sensitive to her, like this is how she's experiencing it, and sort of tagging it on to this concept of anxiety. So would you speak to that?
Yeah. And if we think about our intimate lives, right, it is such a vulnerable, like, space to exist in. And, if this is and it depends on the context of the relationship too, right? Have you been together for many, many years? Is it a newer relationship? And that intersecting with season of life right now too, that for our intimate lives, I think we're going to go through many evolutions with our partner, right? If you're lucky enough to be with perhaps one partner over several years or decades, you're going to have seasons where it's like there's no desire, no intimacy, or there is desire, but it's almost like the gears aren't working together well. And so there's friction, And so the first thing I would say is, like, that's okay. It's normal that you have anxiety. And let's try to understand what that anxiety is trying to teach us about the intimate experience. Is it perhaps my body's evolving and I don't feel as confident, or I don't feel as beautiful as I used to? And that gives me anxiety when I am trying to engage my partner, right? Is it that kind of anxiety? Is it I am getting in my head about how I show up? And is it boring? Am I telling myself stories about our intimate life that are not true, perhaps, right? And so this is why so many, and I'm not a sex therapist or anything like that, but I do work with many couples who are partnered. And that's why so many of the people who work in sexual kind of health and education, communication between partners is the foundation for the evolutions that we go through, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, if I'm feeling that sexual anxiety, then could we find a space to talk about it, to tell our partner, I'm suddenly feeling this anxiety, and I don't know that I've figured it out yet, But I do feel when, we're about to engage intimately, that there's this maybe increased heart rate, or I feel like my mind starts to feel dizzy and fuzzy, or I notice I'm perspiring more than I used to. My body is literally reacting to this.
Mm-hmm.
And what could we do in our dynamic and partnership to, one, lower the stakes a little bit, right? Reduce some of maybe the mental pressure around performance, around intimacy. And how do we talk through the needs, the desires, and the wants of each partner? Because honestly, if you've been together for a long time, sometimes it's just like the autopilot mode, right? You don't really
Sure.
talk through wants, needs, what's changed, what feels good, what no longer feels good. And so can we increase some of that communication, build some safety around that intimate space, and maybe do something different, even like exploration, which isn't so focused on the act of physical intimacy, but all that leads up to it, which is also really beautiful too. So we could talk all day about this topic, but I would say communication would be a really important piece to start that kind of exploration into what the next phase looks like for that couple.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Next community question. She writes, I'm truly uncomfortable talking about how miserable I feel. And I almost feel triggered by the fact that I've had depression and anxiety most of my life. Any thoughts for me?
Yeah. So normal, right? That like a lot of times we don't want to be the Debbie Downer. We don't want to be the one that's always like, I don't feel good. I'm not happy, or I'm not feeling kind of like in a place of thriving. So we might self-silence, self-limit, and such a normal response. At the same time, it costs us something if we don't share, which is connection, empathy, support, community care, So it's kind of like, and also I think as women with social media and all those pressures, there's this like, let's make our lives look perfect, right?
It's cruel. It's hard.
It's hard. And it actually maintains that expectation of perfection for all of us, right? Because if what I show is this image of perfection, then what somebody receives that as is, I'm only allowed to be that.
Right.
And that's why we love those social media posts where somebody's like, in their PJs, taking their kids to school, like looking like
I dissolved today.
Exactly, right?
Sure.
But it's so refreshing because I think it gives us permission to be like, yes, I'm fully human too. And I'm allowed to also, right, not be this image of perfection. So I think that there's also something really powerful of what I like to call the gift of going second. And what I mean by that is when we can actually be honest and vulnerable about our struggle or what's just difficult, we give others the gift of then going next in that process of sharing. And so many times I've noticed, like, maybe I do share a little bit about how actually hard life has been. And that suddenly opens up for that other person, and they can share with me how hard life has been. And there's a sense of mirroring, right? The brains want to mirror that emotional connection and empathy. And sometimes we're not solving each other's life problems in that conversation, but we're doing the practice of being with in those problems. And that sometimes can be a balm, right? It can be a sense of, even though this is hard, I'm not alone. I'm not failing. This is normal, and it's a season for me. The other part of that comment or question was, I'm actually triggered because I've had depression, anxiety my whole life. And I can then understand, right? We can now understand why it is so difficult, right? Because it's not a time limited thing. It's something that somebody struggled with over maybe a lifetime. And that makes me think about, right, perhaps the sense of shame that one might carry for having had those struggles in the first place, right? that I somehow wasn't strong enough. I couldn't tough it out. I struggled with depression, anxiety. And so we might develop some shame stories, and shame is fed through silence. The more silent we are, the increase the shame around things like mental health struggles, trauma, right, abuse. And it then heightens the danger around those things, because we get stuck in our own minds about our own stories, about our role in those difficulties, when they're natural and normal processes of human experience. So I think the antidote to shame is actually having a space that's safe to have a voice, because then we're wrapped with lots of love. We're wrapped with lots of empathy that says, oh my, that's not unusual. You're not alone. I've been through that. And that slowly melts away the shame that we have around it.
Ugh, I just love you, Dr. Wang.
No.
God, there was a question I was going to ask earlier that you just sort of brought up. And then a comment came in here to the chat that I want to get to, but so much of your content is speaking to and on behalf of a population of people who tend not to seek out mental health support. And I think, where this piece of the conversation meets a crossroads, sort of the perimenopause and the not seeking help, is that, no matter a woman's ethnicity or racial makeup or whatever it is, there may also be sort of a deep tension around seeking help. So I just sort of highlight that to piggyback of what you just shared, and sort of the importance of coming out, and, as you say so often, naming the thing and naming the thing for each other. I love this idea that you illustrated of sort of mirroring and being allowed to mirror. That being said, I just want to point out this comment. I have never had anxiety or panic attacks, and I just started having both at this stage. Any tips are much appreciated. I feel like this sudden anxiety is definitely linked to hormones.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because that is actually a normal and common experience for people, that they didn't have anxiety or panic in their young adult life, which is typically the onset of anxiety disorders would be earlier in life, maybe in like teen, even for some people, early childhood or young adulthood. But, right, if onset is later in life, that gives us even more reason to believe that it may be related to a perimenopausal phenomenon, right? Because if typical onset for typical, anxiety is at a different age than when you're experiencing it, and you are female, and perhaps you do have data suggesting that your hormones are changing, then yes, this is something where it's happening beyond your control, right?
Sure.
And it feels like suddenly you can't cope. It feels like suddenly you're not able to handle it. And that's not true. It just means that those hormones are thinning out that cushion again, right? So one is, do not personalize it. Do not blame yourself. Do not start creating narratives around your weakness, your deficiency, your inability to cope with life. It is that your resources, right, are being affected. And one is, could you link up with either resources, books, workbooks surrounding anxiety, panic? There's many out there. You can just Google, like even in Amazon, anxiety workbooks. Develop some skills, right? I always say to people that, like, if you're struggling with anxiety suddenly later in life, then that means that you had the privilege or the luck of never having really anxiety earlier. So you never had to develop skills for right now, right?
Right.
So it means that, there are definitely tools, like when you have a panic attack, how do you regulate the body again? Because it means that the nervous system is so activated, it's telling you, oh, I can't control how I feel. And so even like splashing ice cold water on your face stimulates a calming effect on the nervous system. And so there are these little tools and tricks that, even in the mental health sphere, it would apply to biologically driven
Sure.
anxiety, you know?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say is either, gaining some of those tools, buying some books surrounding anxiety, or finding a mental health professional who specializes in panic and anxiety to just help you develop some of that toolkit a little bit.
Okay.
And you will move through. And I think what's important is we have to remember that this season is a stage. It's like an era, right?
Right.
So one day you will come out of it.
Yeah.
And the cushion that we build around this season is what's going to make it tolerable or really miserable for
Yeah.
us. So
Yeah.
can we give ourselves permission to access those tools that are already available?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Another question for you. This is interesting, sort of actually, given what you just said about anxiety sort of just showing up. This person says, I feel at times like I'm losing it. And although I've suffered with anxiety my entire life, everything feels really, really heightened. I don't know what to do.
Yes. So you mentioned the word stickiness earlier, and I forgot to kind of go deeper on that. I will talk to clients about how when our cushion is thinned out, things become real sticky. So in the sense that when our cushion is thick, it's almost like we're like that non-stick material, like Teflon, that like when somebody says something, it can bounce off pretty easily. When a stressor comes up, it kind of gets there and it slides off, right? It's not sticky. It doesn't stay with us. But anxiety in its kind of essence is something kind of enters into our awareness and we stick with it, right? It affects us. And not only does it affect us in the moment, we now take it and run with it. We go down these rabbit holes of rumination, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, right? And so with anxiety, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy is really helpful because it helps us challenge some of these cognitive distortions that worsen the triggers, right? So all of us, we have triggers in our lives that we don't even care about. We don't even notice. We don't respond to. Whereas for someone else, it is highly activating. It gets under their skin. They can't sleep. They can't, right, function in their day. And so one of those things that I think is helpful to think about is, can you name what those triggers are? Are there tangible ways that you can protect from them, reduce them, create space around them, right? And then learn those skills because you're not going crazy, right? You're not losing it, but it's that your ability to let things slide off is weakened.
Yeah.
And that can happen under so many circumstances. But perimenopause is one of those.
It's a big one. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Next question. Oh, this one's interesting. Is all of this, my anxiety, my moodiness, really about my effed up childhood? She laughed. She wrote, LOL. I mean, I feel like that's really my problem and I should probably deal with it. I know my hormones are all over the place, but I'm guessing this is the real issue, right? That's what she asks.
That's such a great question. And I think that it could be both and, right? That we talked about earlier how sometimes perimenopause almost like digs up some stuff, right? Some deep-seated stuff that previously in other seasons we could keep under the radar, kind of like semi-controlled so that it doesn't push through to our conscious day-to-day. But sometimes perimenopause kind of says, oh, we're going to get rid of some of that inhibitory response. And so things start creeping up. On top of that, you're hitting middle life. Their midlife crisis was coined for a reason. So it's going to start making you question some of these existential questions. What am I doing with my life? Am I in the right career? Is the right partnership for me? Am I happy? This is my one chance to make my life go in a certain direction that I actually wanted to. So lots of existential feelings also come up. Well, when we're talking about existential questions and feelings, that naturally also makes us think, where did we come from?
Right.
What were the stories? What were the narratives, right, that inform what's coming next.
Mm.
So I feel as though there's a both and, in the sense that, yes, it could be both. And I think we could address both in this season too. In the current day and here and now, those skills help you cope in the day-to-day. But you could also go back in time, perhaps with a safe therapist or mental health professional, or even a trusted like friend, to be like, what did happen back there that's creating the conditions in which I'm showing up like this now? Right? Because I always say to my therapy clients, we don't bring up the past to get you all riled up in the present and then feel like my life is out of control, right? Because that's not really trauma-informed work, right? That's not the purpose, to be like, let's dig up all this dark, hard stuff and then send you about your day and say, good luck, right?
Good luck. Yeah. Right.
Our goal is to go into the past and say, wow, that happened to you then. And that might explain why, when you're in a similar situation now, then you show up in this way, and it actually might make things worse. It helped you back then, but for right now, we haven't updated the coping, right? And so we understand the past to understand the lens within which we're perceiving the present. And if we can understand that lens, then we can also try to shift the lens or clarify the lens or use the adult version of myself to address these things. Because often we're reacting with the childlike self, right? The version of us that felt out of control, unsupported, ignored, or what have you. And that's, I think, a lot of what therapy work is to say, let's try to begin healing that inner child so that we can approach life with the adult empowered self and build this self up.
You know, you're making me think too of so much of your work, which speaks about childhood trauma, children of immigrants, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, racism, and sort of other quote unquote taboo topics. And, you know, all of us have a story. Many of us have multiple stories, and all of these different facets of ourselves that were, you know, formed in our early years and sort of help to dictate, as you say, sort of how we're functioning today. And I just love if you could spend a couple of minutes sort of touching on any one of those things, or however many of those things, and sort of threading the needle for us around why anxiety might also rear up given those pieces, like not just our hormones, but as you mentioned, childhood traumas or intergenerational traumas, racial traumas, these kinds of things. Because, you know, like I know, for example, right, we speak, for example, about weathering and Black women in particular, and sort of, you know, having especially difficult perimenopause, menopause, postmenopausal lives because of this, you know, systemic existence, and sort of it being in a state of responding to racism every day. So could you just hover on that a bit before we go on?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, one example that I think may cross it, not necessarily racial or even immigrant, but like if you come from a family where there was poverty, right? There was scarcity in resources, right? Then scarcity mentality is one that you live with every day, right? So there could never be enough, and you would never waste any resource that you had available to you, right? This idea of like, eat everything on your plate, right? Like I remember being told that because your parents worked really hard to put stuff on your plate. And now as I'm a parent, I have to fight that urge of being like, y'all are being wasteful. Why are you doing this? Right? And I have to like give pause and say, well, but I'm also teaching the value of my kids listening to their own bodies,
Mm.
understanding their fullness and hunger signals. And if I force them to eat everything on their plate, will they know that they have the ability to regulate themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or how scarcity mentality shows up in like hustle productivity culture, right? You should always be trying to get more, make more, burn yourself to the ground so that, right, it is, right, something that you should be working until you're like to the bone, right? And in that, I think that also becomes really complex, you know, and I think something we have to be mindful of. So I think that what we're talking about is that we all have facets of our identity, race, gender, right? Even ability, right? Having a disability, being able-bodied, all of those create complexity for us. And the world, right, says, oh, well, this is not enough. Being this identity is not enough or isn't valid. And so that exerts stress on us as humans. And so having to meet that, right? Having to show up and say, in spite of my depression or anxiety, I have to expect myself to function at 110%. Right? People can have high functioning depression and anxiety. They can do all the things, check all the boxes, and at home feel so depleted because they're working from a deficit in the sense that they have to work so much harder to function at that level when they're carrying the weight of depression or anxiety. So all of those exert pressures and weight on us. So it's kind of like we're not starting off at equal footing. And we never are, right? We're not like the next person sitting next to us, but we are all carrying our own stories or our own difficulties, and expecting all of us to then show up at that same level seems really unfair, no matter what that marginality is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, I just want to acknowledge somebody wrote in that they were disappointed that they thought this conversation was going to be more about perimenopause and anxiety and hormones and not racism. I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge that comment. I do appreciate getting it. I also feel like it's really important that we flush out all of what can sort of rear up and sort of contribute to anxiety and perimenopause. And it isn't just hormones. And the advantage that we have in speaking with you, a mental health a counselor, a psychologist, is that you bring in much more to the conversation than the piece about hormones. So I just want to acknowledge that I feel badly that somebody would feel badly about the conversation that we're having, but I do think that all of these pieces contribute. And certainly, as I said before, Dr. Wang, the floor is open to you to bring in sort of more of those 5 surprising things that contribute to perimenopause and anxiety. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that it is more than just hormones, and there are things in life that contribute to sort of the dialing up of anxiety, and you're speaking to those repeatedly. So I want to just say that out loud.
Thank you for naming that and acknowledging that. And I have to be honest, when I read the comment, like I felt an activation. You know, and it felt like, whoa, like, you know, this inability to hold space, right, for maybe an experience that I don't have, but somebody else does, right? And I think that's what we're talking about in the cross empathy, is that just because perhaps I don't have a physical disability doesn't mean that that doesn't exist or impact someone during perimenopause or menopause. And so all of that is important and a facet of a person's identity that can impact someone else, but not me, because I have the privilege of being fully able-bodied. Right?
Thank you for that.
So yeah, I appreciate
I want to read a bit more of what people said. Someone wrote this particular point is related to perimenopause and all the rest through the lane of mental health. It's all integrated. I think it's sad that you feel it's not helpful to get educated on others' perspectives. This conversation has been super helpful because it's so much more than just hormone fluctuations. Mental health plays into so much of our biology. I appreciate those comments very much. We are these, for lack of a better word, these holistic beings. We are mental, emotional, physical, hormonal, all of it. And I'm a believer personally that all sort of can inform the other. Having a scarcity mentality will actually have an impact on your physiological health. And I think, what happens, as you illustrated so beautifully, about this sort of like cushion getting thinned out around this season of life, or during this season of life, because in large part to hormonal fluctuations, sort of makes us more vulnerable to these triggers, these moments of anxiety, these moody blues, these depressive episodes, and so on. Does that sound accurate, fair?
For sure. Yes. And I think that, like, because the comment was about racism, like racism to me in how I feel in my body even is, I don't feel safe because of my ethnicity or race, and being Asian American in post-COVID era, where there was a lot of anti-Asian violence, there were kids in my kids' schools who were making comments about Kung flu and going back to China. We're not even from China, right? Those things stressed me out. It scared me that my parents had to go to grocery stores while there were elders being pushed down in the streets in other cities, right? So to say that doesn't belong in a conversation about mental health feels a little bit misguided. Because if I don't feel safe in my environment, then I'm constantly hypervigilant. And if you feel hypervigilant, guess what? That activates your anxiety, right?
Yes.
So it is interconnected, and some of us have the privilege of going into spaces and not feeling that anxiety. And that's awesome. And I'm so glad for you, but not
many
all of
others
us
don't
have that. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for that. Dr. Wang, before we wrap up, you spoke about briefly the cost of not getting help. You mentioned empathy, connection, and I just want to give you an opportunity again to sort of, speak to the value of seeking out help.
Yeah, I think a lot about my mom's generation, where she can speak English, but it's not in a comfortable level where she could seek out a mental health professional who speaks English, right? So there's lots of stigma, lots of barriers for, let's say, the older generation to approach mental health. And I can observe the costs then, right? Is that, when we don't seek out help, we don't change anything about how we address our life or our stressors. So we talked about skill development, right? I think that when we seek help, we see things differently that we would not necessarily see it that way. We have somebody on the outside observing and saying, oh, that's a really interesting interpretation. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of it that way. So when we're stuck in our minds and only keeping it within ourselves, we kind of get in this echo chamber of like reinforcing our biases, our interpretations, our assumptions as accurate truth. When in actuality, life is much more nuanced, right? So 1, we miss out on skill development. 2, we don't feel any better because nothing has changed in our lives.
Right.
We also lose out on connecting with other people, the connection that comes with having real emotional relationships with other people. And we also are not able to build the life that we want to live because we get stuck in these neural pathways, our brain biology, right? The neurons that fire together, wire together. So if our way of thinking is very pessimistic or very anxiety laden, then if we keep thinking in those pathways, they get more and more strengthened and ingrained.
Right.
So we lose out on honestly living a life that might be worth living for each of us. And I'm not saying that seeking out mental health care is easy. I want to name that it is actually quite difficult, especially if you have certain identity backgrounds or parts of yourself where it's hard to find a therapist who may understand you. I always say it's kind of like dating when you're trying to find a therapist.
Right.
But when there is a good fit, when there's a sense of resonance, a sense of understanding with the therapist, it gives you perhaps the one space in your life where you have the undivided loving presence of another person. And think about the last time you had that, where you had somebody in your life who was like, I care about you. This is all about you. I want to listen. I want to understand. And I'm not going to judge you at all. I'm not going to try to fix you either, because there's nothing wrong with you, right? I think that is such a precious, sacred experience. And I think that's why mental health support can be so powerful. And it not only helps you, but you learn how to do that and offer that to other people. It makes you a better partner, a better parent, a better sibling, a better child, a better friend. Those are things that I think permeate beyond just improving your life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Dr. Wang, I just adore you. You're just an absolute, really just skilled, gifted, soothing, encouraging, compassionate, all of the things that we would want in a healthcare practitioner and in a friend. I so appreciate your highlighting all the points that you did, and ultimately I think that CBT is probably for many the avenue to consider during this season of life, should anxiety be sort of rearing up for you. That sounds like a place to land. And for those who may find it challenging to sort of access, are you a supporter of telehealth in that way? And I think it's
Yes.
a good resource? Or
Absolutely. I think telehealth has opened up access in such a powerful way. You know, people don't need to get in their cars, sit in traffic for 30 minutes to go see their therapist and go back late to work. I mean, it's opened up the world in such a powerful way. CBT is one option, but there's dialectical behavior therapy. There are narrative-based therapies. There's lots of approaches that I think can be powerful. CBT is very skills-based oriented, which it complements really well for anxiety specifically. But many therapeutic approaches that also can support that work. And some clinicians like myself, I kind of do hybrid. I kind of select elements of different models that I think help a client holistically, just because CBT can be very didactic, can be very skills-based, but we know that healing happens through relationships. And so there's that human element that I think also comes from other therapeutic models. Another thing I don't want to minimize is that some people, talk therapy is not for them.
Yeah,
too,
really
right?
important.
And I don't want to say that like only therapy is the only way. Exercise is one of the most powerful things you can do in terms of mental health, as well as anxiety. And especially in the perimenopausal season, where it's very heavily biologic driven, exercise, movement, because part of anxiety is physical angst, right? It is I can't control all this energy that the anxiety is producing.
Right.
So even having a physical release, even sexual intimacy is a release too, right? So let's not minimize that there are healing practices that our ancestors and our people have been drawing from for decades and generations, like dance, rhythm, movement, right? All those things can also be really healing. So draw upon those as well that fit right for you. And I think that telemedicine, you know, there are certain conditions where people would say, you know, it's helpful to see somebody in person, like psychosis, eating disorders, things like that, where you're like, I want to be in the room with the person. But telehealth has been very powerful for many, many clients. And I would say most of my clients have stayed telehealth since March 2020. So if that's something that you're open to, try it, see if it works, right? And if it doesn't, you can always transition to somebody in person.
Dr. Wang, finally, someone said, this has been awesome. So thankful for the insight, the information, and the resources through this time. I have to say, I truly think you're just a phenomenal person and practitioner. Your approach, your way, your expansiveness, your inclusiveness is really critical. And for those who might listen to this episode later, if you are not following Dr. Wang, please do. If you have interest in yourself, your own ability to sort of be better, feel better in the world, and also know about other people, and ultimately how truly similar we all are and how glorious our differences might be. Please follow Dr. Wang. Thank you so very, very much for being here. I can't thank you enough. You're just precious to all.
Well, the feeling is very mutual. Thank you for all of your
you.
work
Just
to
a
raise
pleasure.
awareness.
Thank you.
Thank
Be well.
you.
Thanks to everyone who came.